Welcome back to the HDR Masterclass. In this segment, I'm going to be stepping you through tone mapping using Photomatix Pro. This particular version is 5.1.1. This is the paid license, so this should be very similar to what you normally will see with Photomatix Pro. Now, first thing we want to do is to load the bracketed photos. And I'm going to just go ahead and select these three. These are three images that I'm using for the demonstration purposes of tone mapping. I am going to make these three images available to you so that you can download them as a resource and experiment with them yourself. I'll warn you, this is a very challenging HDR set of image sequences, and I made them challenging for a very specific reason, to be able to more fully demonstrate the challenges that we're faced in HDR photography from time to time. So I have my three raw images. The .cr2 is it's a file extension that Canon uses for their raw images. So a .cr2, that is a Canon raw image format. So let's go ahead and open those. Now you'll notice that I have the show 32-bit uncompressed image is checked on. And the reason for that is I want Photomatix Pro to produce for me and show me the uncompressed 32-bit image so that I can save it. So let's go ahead and OK that and start the merging process. Now, you'll note here that I have cropped align images is checked on. I normally leave that on, and basically that will what that will do is Photomatix, if it finds during the alignment process that one or multiple of the images are actually have to be realigned and there's some excess image area that is remaining, it will actually be cropped out for me. You'll notice here that I have on tripod selected. I am not a proponent of handheld HDR photography, although it does happen and there are places for it. It's nice that Photomatix Pro and many HDR software applications will actually provide provisions for aligning handheld. In this particular case, I'm on tripod, so that's what we'll pick. I'm going to leave the show options to remove ghost. I'm going to leave that checked so that I can show you very briefly the functionality for handling ghosts. However, this particular scene was on tripod. It was not in an open area such as a landscape where any type of movement could possibly have occurred. I do not need a deghosting functionality here, but I'm going to leave that checked to be able to show you the deghosting functionality very briefly. Now, I am not going to check reduce noise on. I do not like processing of my images to occur that I'm not in control of. I typically do not select this particular option. I do not want Photomatix to apply any type of noise processing or pre-processing on my behalf. I'm also going to leave the reduce chromatic aberrations. I'm going to leave that unchecked because I know that the lens that I used, the camera that I used, these images were taken with a Canon 6D. I know that my lens is a higher quality and I probably do not have any chromatic aberrations, and if I do not want Photomatix to take care of that. I also will not alter the white balance that is being applied to these images. When I'm in the field and I'm shooting for HDR, and if you recall in the field guide, it was one of the options was to set your white balance. I want Photomatix to take the white balance as it's shot and not apply any other white balance. I do not want my HDR software to be altering the white balance of the images that I'm merging. I don't want Photomatix to do that for me, so I always leave it as shot. But that's your preference. And typically I'll work with the Adobe RGB color gamut, so I'll leave it there. All right, so we're all set now. I'm going to align and show deghosting. As I mentioned before, deghosting is not really necessary in this case because I happen to know that my images do not have any movement within them. So I'm going to go ahead and let Photomatix do the merging. Obviously, the first thing it's doing is it's converting the raw into an internal TIFF. It's very nice that Photomatix actually has the capabilities to work with raw images. Now it's doing the aligning. All right, so now I have my deghosting options window. Now this is the image we're working with. It was shot on tripod. It is not out in the open. There is no possibility that there's any ghosting in this particular scene, and that was by design because that's what I intended. But if I had a ghosting situation, the first step is that I would choose the area where there is ghosting. All right, and then I would right click on that and I would mark that as a potential ghosting area, and then I would go ahead and apply the deghosting, and it would go ahead and try to make an effort to deal with that one selected area with that I marked as a potential ghosting scenario, and it would try to cope with that. So all right, but I don't really need deghosting in this particular case, so we'll move forward. So now what it's doing is it's merging to HDR. This is where it's actually taking those 3 raw images and processing them, merging them into an HDR. An HDR file is a 32-bit format. Typically, it will be marked with the extension .HDR. So now we have the HDR, the 32-bit image, and it looks horrible. And the reason that it looks as bad as it does is because we're actually trying to view a 32-bit image on an 8-bit LCD monitor. And so the monitor just does not have the dynamic range to be able to handle the very intense highlights and the very dark, deep shadows. And this background here is just completely underexposed. However, we can't be fooled by this because this is a 32-bit that has, what, 4.3 billion potential tonal range for each pixel. We're trying to view this on an 8-bit monitor, so it doesn't work. But the reason that I told Photomatix to show me the 32-bit file is because I am now able to save this image. And now you'll notice here's an HDR, and I'm going to save it back into my folder. And now I have, let's take a look at it here. Now I have a file that is a 32-bit file that has been saved for me. And what I can do is in the future, I can simply double-click on that or reopen it with Photomatix Pro, and I'm right back to this stage right here. So that allows me to have a 32-bit file saved to my hard drive where I can, in the future sometime, come back into Photomatix Pro and retone map it for possibly a different effect. But if I don't do this, if I don't save this .hdr file, I would actually have to remerge each of these images here, and then I would have to really start all over with the merging and the deghosting and all that stuff. So this is why I always save an HDR file right from Photomatix Pro. So now we're now at the point where the merging is complete, the deghosting is complete if that was necessary, and we are now ready to tone map. So I'm going to go ahead and click the tone map. Let's get this started here. All right, now Photomatix has taken the 32-bit image and it has opened it up into a user interface that I can work with. You'll probably remember from our previous discussion that this is our adjustments panel. This is our preview panel, so we can see real time what is happening to our image as we adjust items here in the adjustments panel. Over here, these are our presets panel, and Photomatix does a really good job in presenting us with a number of different presets that we can work with. This is my histogram. Now that is a very important visual tool for me when I'm tone mapping. Now let's just assume here that the histogram, for whatever reason, is not available when you open up Photomatix Pro. Simply go to View and then open up your histogram. Very important tool for me. The first thing I do, as I have mentioned in previous segments, is I make sure that I'm actually starting with the default preset. Now I just click that, and the default preset does a couple things. It puts everything in kind of a, I don't know, we'll call it a factory reset position. All these sliders and settings have been set according to what the authors of Photomatix Pro calls a default, but for me it's really a starting point. It also will have pre-selected tone mapping, and as you recall, tone mapping is really the process of preparing your 32-bit or your merged image capture sequence. It's preparing your 32-bit file so that it will properly display on an 8-bit or a low dynamic range display device or printout. And it already looks better, as you can see here. It already looks better, but it's not quite where I want it to be. Now, the other thing that the default preset does is it gives me additional controls that I'm going to be able to work with from my adjustments panel. And I find these controls to be very valuable. Now, all right, so now I have my interface just the way I want it, my adjustment panel, my preview, my histogram, and my presets, although I'm really not going to be using that presets panel anymore. Now, before I start twiddling the knobs, I always ask myself, what are my intentions for this particular image? Now, naturally, this is an interior indoor scene, and obviously I'm trying to go for some realism, although I could very well have an intention to make this a monochrome, and that's the preset for monochrome. Okay, and that gives me the starting point for going for a monochrome image. But that's not what I want to do. I want this to be as realistic of a representation of this scene as possible. So I'm going to be going for realism. Now, back to the adjustments panel. You know, it's tempting to start at the top, work your way down, All right, make your adjustments and so on and so forth. But I don't like to do that. What I like to do is start with the settings that I feel are important or critical even for an early setting so that I can get the best possible foundation to work with. What I always do, maybe I shouldn't say always, but what I prefer to do is I like to start working with the white point. Now, the white point is setting the maximum tone values or the brightness within the scene. Now, if you'll just take a look right in here, right where my mouse is moving, that is extremely bright. That is a very, very high tone. This area right here where my mouse is a very high tone. But now let's take a look at the histogram. You'll notice here on the right of my histogram, I'm indicating I'm not having any clipping. And so actually the distribution of the tones within this histogram here, this is the intensity and this is the distribution of the tones. You'll notice here I don't have any clipping on the highlight side. I also don't have any clipping on the shadow side. So I'm already in pretty good shape here. It just turned out to be that way because I chose the default. But let's take a look here. I'm going to click on that, and this raised another window, a loop that allows me to take a very, very close look at the details within this image. Now what's really nice about this, we can already see here, because I don't have clipping, we already have a situation where the contrast of these tiny types are actually readable. And that is absolutely remarkable. This is one of the advantages of working with HDR, is that you have control of the details of your image to the point where you could actually pull out details like this. A little side story. I have this image here that has been, processed and produced as a standard print. Somebody was looking at it and they started reading the words in the letter, and they said, "My goodness, I've never been able to actually read type print in a photograph before." And this is one of the advantages of working with HDR. So what I like to do, I like to start with the white point, and that gives me the ability to control the maximum highlights within my scene. I just yanked this all the way up here to indicate to you what happens when you adjust the white point. Now you'll notice here that I have clipping on the highlight side, and if I go back to my loop, now the text is beginning to be washed out. I like to start with the white point to get the maximum or the highlights to the point where they are not clipping and where such attributes as this portion of the image is correct. Then what I like to do is turn my attention to the black point. Now the black point is just basically it's the opposite. It's the minimum tones that will be occurring in your image. Now you'll notice here that I have no clipping on the highlights, on the shadows, and this in here could be considered a shadow. That's a shadow in there. Okay, this area over here would be a shadow as well. So if I adjust that and I do something like that, all right, I really yanked it over here, I've deepened or darkened my shadows, and I'm actually starting to get some clipping. Okay, but I do have plenty of range here in this particular image, so yanking it all the way over to the right like that really wasn't an issue. All right, so what I like to do is I like to start with the white point and then move on to the black point, and get my minimum and my maximum tonal values just where I want it in the image. All right, let's take a little break right here, and we'll resume this in the next segment, and then we'll continue on and talk about things like the strength, and we'll talk about gamma, and we'll continue this discussion on tone mapping using Photomatix Pro when we return. So I'll see you in that segment.